try to keep it fairly high level just in the interest of time. But I will go ahead and turn it over to Weiss, who will, I guess, give a brief intro, and then we'll have Ava start with timekeeping after that.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Appreciate everyone's time today. Like you said, our goal for each of these reports will be to address high level the scope as well as what we saw through the reports. We're going to start with employee timekeeping. The focus of this audit, Ava will walk us through specifically our scope, who exactly we were looking at within the employee population, what our audit period was, but more importantly, what we identified: 4 high risk, 1 moderate finding. So with that, I'll pass it to Ava to give us an update on what the results were.
Perfect. Thanks. So you should have on your screen in just a second here a copy of the report that you received earlier. As kind of some background information, our objective here was to evaluate the internal control environment related to the employee timekeeping process. So this included an evaluation of the policies and procedures here at the district, if we're adhering to those policies and procedures, a review of the instructional and training documentation, the appropriateness of review and approvals over time worked, the mathematical accuracy of time paid out, segregation of duties within the timekeeping function, and then also an evaluation of the documentation that would constitute an audit trail of time worked. So we did select a sample of 25 employees across the 4 different timekeeping methods identified. A description of those different methods are on the background pages 5 through 7. These employees sampled did represent different bargaining units and 7 different work sites. So we do have a total of 5 observations here, which Matt mentioned, 4 of which are high risk and 1 which is moderately rated. So Jack, if you could scroll down maybe to our executive summary, we're going to fly by the background pages. Hopefully you've had a chance to review that. Happy to answer any questions at the end, of course. But there's just a lot of good information there on the methods that we identified, the different roles and responsibilities and systems used throughout the process. So observation 1, if maybe we can fly down to page 3. Perfect. All right, so observation 1 is related to timekeeping review and documentation. Here we did identify several issues related to supervisory review and document retention. This affected about 28% of our samples selected. The observation detail breaks down these issues by the different employee timekeeping methods and types, but in summary, 6 of our samples did not have evidence of supervisory review of the time worked. And 1 sample was missing the original timesheet, which meant that a review of the accuracy of time logged and paid could not be performed. So in that specific instance, we were also not in compliant with an FLSA requirement regarding document retention rules. Our recommendation here was that the district should develop some detailed standard operating procedures to define some of those key foundational timekeeping activities like approval and document retention. In management's action plan, which you will see in the detail of each observation, we do have a response stating that the district will agree to develop those standard operating procedures and will also, as recommended, be rolling out a communication plan and training program to really bring those SOPs home. They plan to have both those items done by November of this year. Observation 2 is related to timekeeping submissions. For one of our time methods, one which is used primarily within the transportation department, we saw that overtime and overscheduled hours were approved on average 8 days after the time was worked. This delay required payroll to manually recalculate hours worked. Also, they needed to perform a detailed review of individual timesheets and different transportation data, which then also extended the time in which employees were paid. Ultimately, that meant, again, we were unable to meet another one of those FLSA requirements, which mandates that overtime is paid within the regular payday of the pay period in which it's earned. Our recommendation here really piggybacks off of observation number 1. Again, management did agree to develop some stronger SOPs and training programs, which will include a timeline of expectations for the time submission, time review, and time approval. All right. Observation 3. You've heard me mention a couple different times now the different timekeeping methods. This observation is really centered around that. So in our review, we did identify 4 different timekeeping methods, each of which relied on non-standard paper documentation or independent systems and applications, ultimately creating kind of an inefficient and disjointed timekeeping process. Each of those methods also required different manual adjustments and actions from payroll. We did see that the payroll team was pretty intricately involved at perhaps a level that they shouldn't need to be. However, I will note that we did not identify any instances of inaccurate compensation or erroneous time entry, which perhaps kind of attributed to those extensive reviews performed by payroll. Our recommendation here is to automate and centralize the timekeeping process. This is obviously a big undertaking, could take quite a bit of time. So in the meantime, we did recommend that management standardize the existing manual processes. Management did agree to evaluate what kind of options are available for automating the process. They also plan to have that done by March of next year, 2025. In the meantime, they will be developing and integrating, again, those different SOPs for each of the timekeeping methods so that at least in the decentralized environment, we do have kind of tabs on what the expectations should be for each method for each work site. All right. Observation 4. I've mentioned this a few times in our recommendations so far. This observation really goes into more detail on the SOP issues that we've already identified in this audit. So specifically the payroll department and 6 of the 7 work sites that we reviewed did not have SOPs describing their day-to-day timekeeping activities and expectations. We did list specific recommendations to be included in each SOP in the observations detail, and management, as you know, is already started developing these SOPs. Which brings us to observation 5, PeopleSoft user access. So on one hand, we did find that PeopleSoft user access reviews were routinely performed, which is great. We don't always find that at the school districts that we work with. We did, however, see that the changes requested were not implemented until 8 months after the changes were requested. So that kind of prolonged user access, of course, increases the risk of either accidental or deliberate misuse of access. So our recommendation here was just to tighten up that turnaround time of requested changes. Management stated that they will start to develop those expectations and implement accordingly, which should be done in September. So I flew through that. That was a lot of content, 5 observations. We do talk about some pretty foundational timekeeping concepts here. So I will pause. If there's any questions, I'm happy to go in more detail.
I do have a question. Just from your review, does it appear that this has been a continued process, or is this something where you're first denoting these issues relating to the timekeeping process?
I will say that management has been aware of several of these issues. It's as you know, the fix for this, especially when we were talking about observation 3 and automating this process, is not a simple fix. Definitely takes time and resource and energy, and for stakeholders across the district to really be on the same page. So while I think we provided a lot of detail that perhaps management was not initially aware of, I do think that the issues themselves management probably was aware of and has been hoping to find a solution for some time. Does that answer your question?
It does, and it adds credence to, I won't call it a concern, but something that needs to be focused on going forward. We will have an elected superintendent. A number of your audit findings have corrective action dates subsequent to the election. And we need to ensure that whoever the incoming superintendent will be, there will be a consistency in the actions as are being placed right now on the incoming superintendent. Obviously, they have the right to modify how they wish to timelines, corrective actions, etc. I do see CFO is cited as a responsible party. I would hope that that position will not be one that will be replaced, and therefore we will have some consistency or corrective action. But we do need to be cognizant of all of these audit findings that you have, because a lot of them, the corrective action dates are subsequent to the election.
Paul, it's Jim Ward. Could I ask a few questions, please?
Absolutely, please, Mr. Ward.
Ava, when you talk about standard operating procedures or processes that you've recommended, are these procedures and processes that should have been in place already that you've audited, or are these new processes or procedures that you're recommending be implemented to fix the issues that you've noted?
Great question. The short answer, I think, is both. First, there are some just foundational across the board expectations that ideally would be implemented in every organization, regardless of the organization, before operations actually take place. Those are kind of the foundational timekeeping topics. There are also, and that's what we tested against as well. For any additional timekeeping method, and as you know, there are several that we identified in this audit, there are certain policies and procedures that should be specific enough to teach each work site how to carry out those foundational concepts at a unique work site level to match whatever system or application or paper documentation that they're using. But I would say the majority of what we tested against and unfortunately did not find are some pretty key foundational timekeeping processes.
So that's kind of what I'm leaning towards in terms of understanding this, is that these processes and procedures should have been in place, and in your audit, you found that they were not being followed. Is that accurate?
That's accurate.
Okay. The second question is related to your comment about automating manual processes. So can you just walk me through briefly, if you can, why these processes are manual and not automated already?
I don't know that I can provide management level detail as to why certain processes are not automated right now. I do want to mention that every school district we have been at, in most cases, utilizes a different system, a different process, has approached it a different way. And even in instances where there are automated systems, I don't think we've ever had a totally clean timekeeping internal audit report. So it's certainly not a very straightforward concept, and there are several different ways to approach it. But I think management would have to, I defer to management on specific reasoning as to why it's not automated right now.
Okay.
And if I could real quick, this is Clara from RSM. You know, Ava was spot on with what she was saying. What we see at a lot of our school districts, it's a combination, right? A lot of manual processes, some automation, and maybe just not fully utilizing the system as they can, or the system doesn't have the capability to allow them with some of those functionalities. So it's a process that they need to go through to see what the functionality is in order to be able to enhance those processes for more efficiency and more automation. But again, you know, when we typically find when we're first looking at timekeeping for our school districts and a lot of our local governments, there's a lot of manual components in there, and we like to try to give them examples on how to improve upon that.
Okay. So you touched on something that I was going to ask as a last point. In discussing what you've found, it would be helpful, I think, if you kind of gave us an overall opinion as to whether this is a concern that you find in many of your audits, or if it's somewhat unique to this particular audit, so we can have a context of whether this is unusual or it's something you find generally as you go through an audit of a school system, for example.
Yeah, so we don't opine, as internal auditors, we do not opine, but we can provide the commentary. What we have seen here, we do see in a lot of other school districts, like I said, in other local governments as well. There's a lot of pay classifications. There's a lot of different types of pay, a lot of different types of employees. So there's a lot of processes that go along with the timekeeping and the payment to employees.
All right, thank you.
Mhm.
Chair Cohen, if I may?
Yes,
Can you hear
please.
me? Okay. What I would like to see, if possible, not only on this particular audit, but any others between now and when the superintendent, whoever it may be, gets elected. If I was a newly elected superintendent, I would want to see this. So we need to see if there's some way to schedule the same briefing and results for the new superintendent, which will be after in November. But since they're going to be the ultimate person responsible, because it's under operations, we need to keep that in our thoughts that we can do that.
Yeah, and as the board's internal auditors, we are more than happy to meet with that new superintendent to kind of go through the history, where Lee School started, where they are now, and we can go over the reports that have been issued to Lee Schools and a high level overview of the findings. We're more than happy to do that.
As long as we understand that it's within the context that you were the board's internal auditor.
Correct.
So it would be part of the board transitioning of the superintendent, where the board can make that determination of your involvement.
Correct.
But
We can
Mr.
say,
Parsons'
yeah,
report is well stated.
absolutely. And we can say this, this is, we are acting, we are doing this at the request of the board as their internal auditor.
Thank you. And that is something, Mr. Persons, I
Yes.
think that it will probably behoove us, whether we make it as a motion or recommendation from this committee to ensure that that does occur, or we wait until we get closer to election time and at that point, bring that message forward, or yourself as our board liaison, you can bring that thought forward to the school board.
Yeah, I would probably rather bring it forward to the board sooner than later, because there'll be other ones coming too, most likely. So I just think it needs to be done because it's a whole new era, like you said earlier, Chair Cohen, that with a new elected superintendent and a board trying to work together. But I had just one other question. I know that y'all are not looking specifically for fraud, but with 4 highs there, that worries me that there could be quite a bit of that. I don't know if y'all saw anything that we need to worry about immediately, or just so far we're just being a little sloppy, need to tighten up all these different procedures here. I just wanted to get your opinions on how serious it is right now. I know the risk is high, but how serious is it for stuff?
Go ahead,
Oh,
Matthew.
sorry.
Go ahead.
Weiss, yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I don't sound as great as Matthew. Thank you, but I was just going to jump in. I think that you raise a good point, Mr. Persons. I think as part when we talk about our risk assessment shortly, I think you'll see we have an inclusion there that I think is an extension of the results here that we'll talk through, and our recommendation maybe to continue a cycle audit of this area just to make sure that we're staying cognizant of the manual nature and the decentralized nature of this process to make sure compliance is top of mind. Our procedures weren't necessarily to detect fraud, right? We didn't identify anything necessarily through our procedures, but I just want to clarify, wasn't to detect fraud, but I do think that we recognize the risk here, and that's why we have it included in our proposed audit plan. So I think we can talk more about that when we get into the risk assessment, if you'd like.
Thank you. That's well said.
Okay. Are there any other questions from any other members of the committee? With that, I'll leave it for the next audit to be presented.
Perfect. So the next audit will be asset management. So Jack Hughes was the individual who led this individual audit, and I'll let him walk us through the objective, scope, and the observations that were noted.
Perfect. Thank you, Weiss. Hopefully you can all hear me. I'll be walking us through the next two audits, actually. I'll start with asset management before moving into our fleet operations review. I will follow Ava's cadence, and I will keep it high level on this executive summary page. Just to articulate the primary objective of our internal audit, we did evaluate the adequacy of the district's internal controls, specifically as they related to recording, monitoring, reporting, and safeguarding tangible properties through annual inventories. So under that purview, we did look at compliance with existing policies and procedures. We evaluated segregation of duties within applicable systems. We reviewed the process and documentation that exists to support the periodic inventory counts. And we also evaluated the asset-related information and supporting documents as they align with the system of record. We wanted to make sure that we could verify a complete audit trail and that all information agreed and was consistent across the board. We did that on a sample basis for all of asset additions, transfers, and disposals. We do have 5 observations, as you can see, 2 high risk and 3 moderate risk. Those are detailed and summarized on the page 3. So beginning with our asset addition supporting documentation, we did select a sample of 35 asset additions. A total of 5 exceptions were noted through our testing procedures. Of those, we saw a number 3 in which original vendor invoice data was not retained to support the original cost of the acquisition. And we saw 2 acquisitions supported by vendor invoices in which the cost information did not agree with the system of record in PeopleSoft. We noted, and I'll walk through in a further observation later on, that is a manual procedure that is performed by Property Inventory and Records to transcribe that purchase data into the system. So happy to speak to that further in just a minute. The risk there is that we are unable to support a clear and consistent audit trail, and without that adequate documentation, assessing the legitimacy of asset acquisitions and investigating annual inventory asset variances may become compromised. So we have recommended that the district establish a standard documentation requirements, perhaps through a checklist, to help verify that all necessary documents are being recorded and retained within the system, and that the district explore the potential enhancement of the PeopleSoft system to provide automated alerts notifying management and applicable parties of any missing documentation that were not obtained during the process. Management does intend to establish standardized documentation and document that through further written guidance and standard operating procedures, and facilitate further training of personnel. Our second observation here relates to the disposal of assets approved for write-off. What we saw in our testing is that assets that may have been board approved for write-off were not necessarily communicated, or their physical disposal from sites was not recommunicated to Property Inventory and Records. And the result is that there was a potential disconnect between the party responsible for recording the disposal and the site's responsibility for facilitating that physical disposal of the asset in accordance with board policy. We did sample 25 samples. We saw 1 sample that was not disposed at the time of our review, which was 5 months after the board write-off. And we had 7 additional samples in which documentation to support the physical disposal were not retained by the site. Think your dump receipts or auction receipts, documentation to support the cost recovered from that disposal of the asset. So the lack of adequate documentation does not necessarily permit Property Inventory and Records personnel to verify the accuracy of their current financial records and maintain a transparent and verifiable process for that actual physical disposal of assets following their write-off. We do recommend that the district revise the standard operating procedures to clearly define the document retention expectations to support those write-offs. And we recommend that the district establish a formal mechanism to track and reconcile physical disposals from initiation to completion and recommunicate that to applicable parties. Management has indicated that they will work to clearly define a disposal mechanism to retain evidence of those physical disposals and verify that the system of record agrees to the physical disposal of those assets. The first of our 3 moderate observations relates to the asset transfer supporting documentation. There are 2 documents that are expected to be retained to support the transfer of one asset from one site to the next. Those are a designated form which captures a variety of asset information related to cost, as well as applicable approvals from both site administrators. And there are work orders that are expected to be retained to actually document the facilitation of that transfer. When reviewing our sampled selection, we did see a number of instances, it was for all 25 of our sample where we saw exceptions related to those document expectations. 19 samples did not complete that expected form. On our inquiry with management, we understand that those were not transfers from one site to another. It was purchased by one site and delivered on behalf of one site to a separate facility. And so that documentation in practice was not expected to be retained, but that did not align with the documented standard operating procedures as written. We did see a further 6 samples that did not complete or retain that MIS 048 form as required. And of those 6, 1 additional sample did provide email notification to property inventory and records requesting that the transfer be processed, but did not complete that form. So that incomplete documentation does limit that audit trail, as well as fail to document the required approvals to facilitate those transfers. We do recommend that management, again, potentially explore the opportunity to digitalize some of those transfer forms to make them more accessible to personnel, as well as to improve the capabilities within the system to retain those documents. And additionally, reinforce training and expectation to site custodians what those document expectations are. Management has indicated that they will clarify their standard operating procedures to specify when those forms are required and when they may not be, and are expected to digitalize that form to help with that streamlining of the process. Our fourth observation here is related to asset management oversight. It is inherently a decentralized process, as each site is responsible for maintaining custody of those assets. We did cite a couple board policies in which we saw limited capability from property inventory and records to facilitate some of their duties and responsibilities. For instance, they are expected to perform a physical inventory if there is ever a custodial change at any site. As that custodial change is made, a physical inventory to reconcile all existing assets at that site against the system of record should be performed. However, as it exists currently, there is no mechanism to notify property inventory and records of a custodial change. And so that process may not be performed timely in accordance with policy. The second piece that we saw here is that a formal process for notifying property inventory and records of donated assets is not currently in place. So while purchased assets through district funds, they are able to run a report and identify those assets. No such report is available to management to identify through any automated capability those donated assets. And so we recommend that the district establish a notification mechanism to, 1, update custodial changes to allow for property inventory and records to perform those timely inventories, as well as to determine the process or the best practice for notifying of donated assets. Management is going to include a process and procedure for donated items in documented standard operating procedures yet to be defined, and incorporate those into projected staff trainings, and are anticipating a mechanism to be established to notify the custodial changes as they are incurred by the various sites. Finally, and I've mentioned it a couple times, we do have standard operating procedures. Again, just to clarify, these are procedures that are performed by the district, but may not be written down through formalized guidance. We do highlight in the body of our observation some opportunities to enhance written guidance, and that we recommend that the district perform a comprehensive review of the existing procedural documentation and identify any opportunities to enhance that guidance, as well as to incorporate some of those new mechanisms and procedures into future written guidance and provide those to sites, custodians, as well as retain that within the property inventory and records department. So management is expecting to perform those updates and enhancements and further train those applicable personnel on those changes once they are finalized. So I recognize that was a very high level and quick run through of the 5 observations we have here, but I will pause now in case there are any questions as they relate to either the 2 high or the 3 moderate observations that we recorded through our internal audit procedures.
Are there any questions?
Again, if I
Yes. Yes, please.
specifically as it relates to the disposal of assets, does the district do a physical inventory reconciliation on a periodic basis? And if so, when do they do it?
Yep, that is a great question. So the district is expected to perform a physical inventory for every site within the district annually. Those are scheduled on an ad hoc basis at the beginning of each year and roll forward as timing permits and as schedules align for different management. So what we look at from that disposal perspective is the timeliness of the disposal. Policy and statute do specify that any asset no longer providing value to the district should be disposed as early as possible. So without that mechanism, it's really a timing consideration. We did, in the body of our observation, include some additional context towards that annual inventory mitigating control, but we did look at this from a timeliness perspective and with detailed testing exceptions in which we did see some assets that weren't timely disposed. That is what ultimately elevated up to that high risk observation level.
So with respect to your audit, would that audit have been done prior to the physical reconciliation, and consequently they would not have known some of the issues that you brought forward?
Correct. And to maybe specify, in terms of the timing of that specific exception as it relates to the performance of those physical inventories, I would be unsure as to when the next annual inventory is scheduled for that particular site. We would expect, as part of those annual inventory procedures, that they would identify that that asset was still on premise. Those are indicated as an over, and at that time, the expectation would be recommunicated that that asset is disposed.
I think if I can jump in, Jim, sorry, I think what we're trying to emphasize is that we don't want them to wait until that annual inventory to capture this disposal, right? I think we're trying to emphasize the need for the custodian to maintain adequate records timely. So if there is a disposal, they need to dispose of that timely, and the inventory should just serve, as Jack said, as a mitigating control for that individual item.
Yeah, fully understand that. I'm just trying to understand whether or not the district would have recognized the issue when they did a physical inventory reconciliation.
Yes, hopefully that would have been where they would have caught that this item hasn't been disposed of, correct?
Thank you.
Any other questions, Mr. Ward?
No, thank you, Paul.
Okay. Are there any questions from any other members? With that, I do have several questions and / concerns. The types of assets in question, do we have an idea of the value and types of assets we're talking about in these findings?
So the capital asset threshold has recently changed from a $1,000 threshold to $5,000. In terms of the district's complete asset holdings, I believe that is incorporated into the background of a report to understand kind of the materiality of what is in scope here. I think it is 1.3 billion of net depreciated capital assets across 118 schools and sites.
What I'm asking is relating to your findings themselves.
Absolutely. I think, and I'll defer to our team, but I believe we can provide that materiality. There is some context within the report. Typically, when we talk about disposed assets or missing assets, they should, in theory, be fully depreciated out. And so the materiality of that financial impact is relatively small as it relates to potentially the purchasing or the acquisition costs. But to give you a specific number, I would have to follow up with you following this meeting.
Okay. The one comment you had made also appears to be ordered by one site and delivered to another. Could you elaborate, please?
Absolutely. For instance, the IT department may purchase monitors and have them delivered to specific schools rather than to have them delivered to an IT site and then have to go through a work order process to deliver that using district resources.
Under whose cost center, though, are those monitors being ordered? Are they ordered under IT's cost center
would-
or under this specific school cost center?
It would be ordered under the IT cost center. And so as we performed our testing procedures, we did expect that those transfer forms be completed to document that transition of the asset from one site to the other. Management doesn't currently expect that form to be completed to facilitate that specific type of transfer. However, written guidance as it exists does not reflect that practice.
Which could obviously skew cost center accounting. Okay.
Yes, sir.
The other item you mentioned is donated assets. If you can provide any context to understand if it's significant enough to have any potential income tax implications. So if we are missing opportunity to claim on the district's income taxes, certain amount of charitable or donated contributions, it'd be incumbent on us to try to identify those.
Without access to very specific numbers, again, I would be happy to follow up with that. The overall materiality of donated assets as it relates to the district's total holdings is very small. Donated assets do reflect a very small minority of total district capital assets.
And that's something I just want context. I realize that your sample size is not going to be comprehensive enough to give us the true materiality, but it still would put some context to it where the CFO or accounting department could do further investigation. And I'm going to piggyback on Mr. Ward's question from the prior audit. I'm never comfortable when there are not detailed controls around movement of assets. Do you have any concerns about any fraud potential within this process with the limited documentation that it currently exists?
Well, there's always the potential for fraud in anything that internal audit looks at. You know, we look at fraud, we look at controls related to fraud, but this is, as we stated with the timekeeping report, this is not a fraud investigation. So whatever audit topic we're looking at, whether it's timekeeping, whether it's contract compliance, fleet, asset management, etc., we're going through and we're identifying the risks around this process and the controls that should be in place. And so the key controls that we're looking for preventative, detective, automated, manual, and we're considering fraud related controls as well because it's inherently incorporated how we look at the processes. So your question, could there be fraud? There can always be fraud, but these are internal audits looking at the processes and the controls and not fraud investigations.
No, and I understand that completely, Clara. What my concern is the lack of documented procedures and I'm being cautious in the term, but almost loose processes that currently exist where it's almost verbalized does add to the potential for fraud. Whereas if you have better documented controls in place, you are mitigating to the best of your ability. And you're absolutely right. Fraud can exist anywhere, but the more controls you put in place, it does limit the exposure to potential fraud.
Absolutely.
Yes, thank you.
Mr. Cohen, can I ask a question?
Absolutely, Mr. Carrington.
Yeah, just going back to John, just going back to to the asset management. Now, is the threshold 5,000 and over?
The current threshold, so any asset that is purchased from here on out, as in today, would be a $5,000 threshold.
And is it prior to October 2020, it was 1,000?
Correct. And our audit period extended backwards through January of 2023. And so we did evaluate within our sample assets that were purchased at the prior $1,000 threshold.
Gotcha. Yeah, I just thought it was a little bit odd with the ITS description of monitor being over $1,000. So no, that just seemed a little bit odd in my mind.
Yeah, perhaps not the best example to give as it relates to that $5,000 threshold.
The reason why, just for clarification, is because those are determined to be attractive items, right? So some items may not meet that threshold of $5,000, but they've been identified, usually they're technology assets, as attractive items. So these are expected to be tracked in the same capacity.
Okay, gotcha. Thanks.
Okay, before you go on, I am gonna need to make a request for a motion to extend the amount of time we're going to designate for this meeting. We usually try to align with a 1 hour time limit. We're already up against 50 minutes in. So I would entertain a motion to extend this meeting till 7 p.m., which should give us more than adequate time to conclude this committee meeting.
So moved, Paul.
Thank you. Can I hear a second, please?
Second, this is Gerard.
All in favor?
Aye.
So moved. Jack, if you can continue with the audits to present, please.
Perfect. Thank you. Our next audit report is the Fleet Operations Internal Audit Report. Again, I will start on page 2 with our objectives and scope under the executive summary. The objective of this engagement was to assess whether the internal control structure governing the tracking, recording, and management of district fleet is appropriately designed and functioning effectively. We did, as part of that objective, perform the following. We reviewed procedures for retiring and disposing of fleet assets and evaluated compliance with existing district policy. We performed detailed testing to verify whether routine inspections for preventative maintenance, servicing, and scheduled maintenance are consistently performed and documented, again, with district policy and leading practice. We evaluated whether corrective or unscheduled maintenance, including response times, spare parts availability, and repairs are performed and, again, documented in accordance with district policy. And finally, we looked at the effectiveness of the segregation of duties within the fleet management processes to determine whether key responsibilities are appropriately divided amongst appropriate individuals. We did have 4 observations, 2 high risk and 2 moderate risk, as they related to our testing procedures. Beginning with our fleet vehicle inventory management, through our procedures, we noted that contrary to board policy, yellow fleet vehicles that are no longer fit for service, so they are either inoperable, aged out, or the cost to repair exceeds the cost to replace, those vehicles are retained on district property instead of being written off and disposed of from the financial record. Per our inquiry with management, we understand that this practice is performed to allow the transportation services to cannibalize those buses, to pull individual parts off of buses that may still be usable, while the whole bus may not be, and repurpose those towards the existing fleet of operable buses. As a result, we did see that while the district records over 1,000 buses in its fleet, it has fewer than 750 that are operationally effective. So in addition to that, we did see that there is no process or ability to, 1, identify an inventory of those cannibalized parts. So to understand either A, which parts still remain on buses that are no longer within the district fleet, or 2, determine a population of parts that had been previously repurposed from retired buses. So As a result, there's little capability to determine whether these parts have been subject to potential theft or damage, or to understand what assets may be available towards fleet operations to provide some of those repairs, or repurpose old parts into new or existing fleet assets. We do recommend that the district write off those vehicles that have been retired from service once it has been determined that they are no longer able to meet the district's operational needs, and develop procedures for all usable parts to be stripped off those vehicles at the time of retirement and added into transportation services maintenance parts inventory, rather than to leave them on site and cannibalize them over time. Management does expect that vehicles will now be written off when they're no longer suitable, and they will be developing procedures to document the parts that are cannibalized off those buses at the time of their retirement. Our second high-risk observation relates to preventative maintenance performance. We did select a sample of both yellow fleet, those are your school buses, and white fleet, those are going to be your operational vans, think your maintenance trucks, any specialty vehicle not transporting students are indicated as white fleet vehicles. We selected a sample of both of those and evaluated the preventative maintenance performance as it relates to Florida Administrative Code and internally defined guidance. We did have one exception as it related to yellow fleet that missed its required timeliness of preventative maintenance. That is expected to be performed every 30 days. We had one sample in which that the preventative maintenance went 97 days between inspection. Of our white fleet vehicles, we had a few more exceptions. We had a total of 5 instances in which the maintenance inspections that were performed exceeded the prescribed maintenance calendar established for each respective vehicle. The risk of that is that the district incurs increased maintenance costs on operational vehicles and non-compliance with the mandated inspection intervals as defined by statute and internal policy. We do recommend that the district establish those formal operating procedures and policies to define incompleteness of frequency of that expected preventative maintenance performance for both its yellow and white fleet, and incorporate it into existing documentation, and perform regular training and communication to accompany that implementation to reinforce the expectation amongst all applicable staff members. Management is expected to supplement their current standard operating procedures with maintenance schedules, especially for its white fleet, as standard statute guidance defining the expectations for white fleet preventative maintenance does not necessarily exist. But in line with best practice, they will be developing cadences for each one of its fleet vehicles. And they will also develop an orientation training program for all its new employees to understand the expectations as it relates to preventative maintenance. Our third observation is with regards to manual operating processes. We did note that there are several key fleet management procedures that are performed that are very manual in nature, with opportunity to potentially provide increased automation. The first of which relates to the work order processes and inventory management. Currently, Transportation Services uses a paper work order system that results in an inventory clerk having to transcribe those paper work orders into the system. To supplement that paper work order, they do incorporate a Excel spreadsheet to monitor and track the parts that are being used for each ad hoc repair or documented corrective maintenance procedure. And ultimately, those are reconciled against the PeopleSoft record. However, that spreadsheet must be manually maintained, and as it relates to the manual transcription of those work orders, we do always caution that when we have a manual process such as transcription, that human error absolutely is a possibility. And so automation can minimize the amount of transcription errors that may currently occur. We also see, as it relates to preventative maintenance scheduling, there is no automated process to allow a newly purchased vehicle to be automatically rolled into a preventative maintenance calendar. As a result, Transportation Services must manually identify and assign calendar days for its preventative maintenance performance for each purchased vehicle. So little automation capabilities as it currently exists to make that process a little more efficient as it rolls through the maintenance procedures. We do recommend evaluating the capabilities of the current system to provide that level of automation. And I believe management is currently going to evaluate its capabilities to provide that level of automation. And in lieu of that, they will document more completely the process, the manual processes through standard operating procedures, and develop additional mitigating controls if automation is not practical. Our final observation we have here relates to the vehicle fleet data completeness. I do want to call out very briefly that as part of this report, we do incorporate a number of data analytics to help provide some context behind the composition of the overall district fleet. When we look at those data analytics, we did note that there were a number of data fields that were incomplete. Those related to potentially the asset ID, the age of the vehicle make and model, the vehicle registration number not being recorded, etc. The risk there is that without that complete data set, the fleet managers may not be able to make informed decisions regarding the composition, the repairs, the replacement, identify key metrics such as the overall average age of the fleet, mileage considerations, etc., without that complete data set. Our recommendation there is to explore system capabilities to mandate entries and to coordinate across both the property inventory and records, who records the acquisition of those assets and is expected to perform a number of that data entry, as well as the fleet or the transportation services personnel who kind of supplement some of that data entry. Developing standard operating procedures to ensure that all data fields are completed upon that acquisition and that responsibilities are clearly defined between both the property inventory and records team and transportation services as it relates to that data completeness. The transportation department is expecting to work with that property and inventory records department and technology department to develop procedures to, one, provide for a mandated or automated control to provide for required fields across each one of its vehicle data characteristics, and they will be performing training and a review of data as it is entered on a semi-annual basis. So twice a year, they're expecting to perform reviews of the data entry as it currently exists within the system. So that wraps up the 4 observations as they relate to fleet management. I'm happy to open up the floor to any questions, comments, or concerns as they relate to either one of the, or to any of those 4, I should say.
Any questions from any committee members?
Paul, Jim Ward, please.
Yes, Jim.
You referenced earlier that there were 700 operational vehicles, but there were 1,000 in inventory. Is that correct?
Correct. And as
Okay,
a point
so-
of clarification, that is the buses exclusively.
Okay, yes, okay. So the 1,000 in inventory, is that what is physically on a lot someplace, or is that what's on a inventory record? What I'm trying to understand is 1,000 physically there, or is that something that's on a record someplace?
The district maintains 1,000 physical buses on its property. However, only 750 are fit for service.
So
Okay.
for clarification, Joe, I'm sorry, there's 1,007, and in our background, we do highlight this. We break it down by district site. So they're located across the district, right? Career and adult education, Island Coast High School, Transportation East, Transportation South, etc. They're spread out throughout the district, 1,007, just to be clear.
I did see that, but what I'm trying to understand is the 300, are those 300 being used to salvage parts?
Correct.
Or is it simply a discrepancy between what is on the book inventory versus what's physically there?
These are items that are on the books inventory, and I believe it's about around 250. That's an approximate number that are on the books, but are not currently operational. So they are all maintained at. Jack, correct me. Which district site are they located at?
I believe the South Transportation site on a lot. I see Dr. Savage nodding. I believe that to be the case.
Okay. You mentioned the software utilization, and I'm trying to understand is part of the issue that they're not using the full capability of the software?
PeopleSoft does. Oh, sorry, Weiss. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I was just going to add. I think that it's a combination. I think that I think that management's trying to determine whether the system currently PeopleSoft can serve the needs of managing a fleet. I think that they're concerned with some of the limitations. So yes, to answer your question, it is in part due to adapting PeopleSoft and using PeopleSoft. So in management's perspective is managing it in the current capacity allows them to meet the needs better than the system can. That's the perceived that's our perception.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions from any other committee members? Okay, I do have a couple of questions. I am noting a lot of the corrective action dates go into the third and fourth quarters of 2025. Are you comfortable with that longer period of time for appropriate corrective action, even though some are risk rated high?
I think from our perspective, when they're high risk, our preference, and it aligns with our risk ratings, which we show here, our preference will always be that that actions be taken immediately or as soon as possible. I think where we're limited in our gaining comfort is management has to make that decision. Management needs to go out and determine, for example, if they want to automate some of the processes and what those capabilities look like. So if they need to explore additional systems to reduce risk, it's management's determination that that's the amount of time that they'll need to perform that analysis and identify the appropriate actions. So we're kind of limited, but our stance will always be action should be taken immediately on high risk items.
And as I brought up earlier, I get a little bit concerned because a couple of your findings carry over past this current elected superintendent, potentially into a secondary potential elected superintendent. So it could go over 2 tenures.
Mm-hmm.
The other question I did have, I know that there's been talk for a lot of years about the correct number of buses available. There was talk about leasing of vehicles, purchasing of vehicles. I've known about the cannibalization because the transportation chief has spoken to several committees about this. I'm kind of taken aback that there are not more detailed procedures in place because other committees where I've served were advised that there were more written procedures. So I'm a little bit taken aback by that. The other concern I do have, and piggybacking on what Mr. Ward said, since we know that there are approximately 750, give or take, active buses, we would probably need for our CFO and other key chiefs to understand how many buses do we truly need for our district. And if there's any crossover with the cannibalization, especially since they're not inventorying parts, they may have run out of parts to keep some of the older vehicles operational. And therefore, we may not have 750 completely operational vehicles. We may have some number less than that. So I would agree firmly with what you had recommended as far as cannibalize those vehicles, write them off, make sure you have a proper inventory of all parts so we know exactly what's going to be available to keep our fleet up and running.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
Are there any questions or concerns from any of the other committee members? With that, I'll leave it for the next presentation to the committee, please.
Perfect. So with that, I'll ask Jack just to move us to page 1 on the follow-up report, and we'll walk through the results. So just a reminder, follow-up testing, the goal here is to look back at audit reports that were previously issued and evaluate the status of management action plans that were noted in those reports. So what you're seeing on the screen here are 5 reports. These are the 5 reports that we reviewed open audit items for. The first being Human Resources, Recruiting and Onboarding, which was issued in 2021, the same time that Purchasing and Procurement Compliance was also delivered. The last 3 here are Contract Compliance, half-cent surtax, and purchasing cards. And you might remember those were the 3 that we issued this past year. So in total, we had 24 items across these 5 reports, and through this follow-up report, we have 13 items that remain open. So we've seen some certainly some progress. I think that the report sheds light onto some of the actions that have been taken and some of the delays that have contributed to some of these items being addressed maybe more timely or maybe more in line with expectations. But I think what I can briefly do is give you an idea of kind of what's causing some of these items to remain open, starting with HR here. So we have 4 items open, as I had said, one that was previously closed. And really what's causing these items to be open it's kind of twofold. One, new processes and trainings that have been put in place. They have enhanced guidance and instruction on a new criteria-based checklist and documentation requirements for new hires. And they have performed training on some of these new processes as recent as February of 2024. So due to the recency of that training, it couldn't be within the scope of what we would look at. We would need an adequate population. I think you'll see that for a number of these items. We also did have some testing exceptions related to I-9 requirements and the retention of key application materials. So these are some of the exceptions we've seen in some of our previous testing. It's definitely cleaner and it's getting better, but we're still noting those exceptions, and so some of those items remain open. So in total, we have 4 there. Purchasing has only 1 item that remains open, and this is related to the vendor master file. They actually have taken some steps. They did do an initial purge of the file in July of 2022, but they did discover an issue in July of 23 where the purge would actually inactivate some of the vendors, but not close them for ordering. So it's actually a system issue. So currently IT is coordinating with Oracle to remediate this issue, but the expectation is that when they get this remediated, that item should be closed. They've definitely taken some steps there. For contract compliance, we have 4 items remain open. This was a fairly large report. The district is currently still exploring contract management software that they can use to automate some of those processes that we've highlighted in that report. They have actually made some changes to process, though, in the meantime, while they manage some of these manually. They have purchases over $50,000 for services that now require a contract, and purchases under $50,000 are now permitted to use a PO. And that was really just to delineate when a PO would be permitted for a purchase. And so this will really just enhance some of the terms that we have in place for some of those services. They also have a new process that was implemented during the last round of follow-up. So we'll be able to come back and look at that when we have a little bit more time. They're also establishing a vendor monitoring system. The estimated completion of that is actually next month. So that should be hopefully something that we see during our next round of testing that we can look at. And they have also enhanced the process for invoice approvals and payments. So bookkeeping staff and finance staff were both been provided training on these updates and these new process changes, and they were performed as recent as May. So again, just the recency of the training prevented us from maybe doing some detailed testing there. So we feel pretty confident that at least 2 of the 4 should be ready for the next follow-up testing. So we've seen a lot of progress there. Moving forward to half cent, we only have 1 item that remains open here. And it really just it relates to some challenges that district experienced when they were implementing their proposed management action plan. So this is really the integration of PeopleSoft, so in expenditure approvals. So this is just some challenges they've faced with PeopleSoft. They're working through that. The estimated completion date is this month. So I feel like based on our conversations with the team that they feel like this should be remediated, and we'll be able to test it during our next round of testing. Lastly is purchasing cards. So only 3 items remain open from the original 6, and they are limited to a couple things. One, they have the Truist banking system that they use for P cards, and there's some limitations in what the banking system can provide. During our audit, we highlighted some audit reports that we felt like they should work with Truist to obtain that could help them enhance their monitoring processes. Through that process, they did identify 2 additional audit reports that they can run, which is great. They didn't necessarily include the capabilities and some of the capabilities that we highlighted, such as who reconciled and improved a transaction, but they are continuing to work with those representatives to identify that. So I think that's a great story. We also did identify some exceptions related to P card policy. One of our testing samples did not retain any of the travel documentation that was required, and another exceeded a single transaction limit. So certainly some opportunity here. We've highlighted that here in the report as to our testing exceptions, but again, 3 out of the 6 have closed, and we feel during our next round of follow-up testing that we should see some progress here. So I'll pause. I know I went through those fairly quickly. Any questions related to follow-up?
Paul, I guess I'll start it
Yes,
off.
Mr. Wood.
I don't see an indication here whether the remaining open items were high risk, moderate risk, or low risk. I'm not sure if I didn't see that in your report or if it's not there. I'm not sure.
So at the time that we issued these, I don't believe that we actually had risk ratings included in our items. We only recently started including the risk ratings this past year. So you might not, that might be why you're not seeing them. I'm looking through the report now because I believe last year we should have had.
That's correct, Weiss. When the district first started the internal audit program, as we typically do, we don't always include risk ratings early on while the function is starting to mature, because oftentimes that can cause a lot of consternation rather than focusing on the issues at hand. And so as the process has matured over the last couple of years, the reports that we've issued this year are the ones where we really started putting the risk ratings in. So there are no risk ratings for these because they weren't in the original reports.
So the reports that were done in May of 2021, have there been updates as to whether or not there were open items still in place prior to this report?
If you're asking whether we've performed follow-up testing on those first 2 reports?
Well, obviously I'm concerned that something that was done in 2021 still had 4 items open in the case of human resources. And I'm just wondering if you had performed or indicated to the audit committee that these were still outstanding a year or 2 ago.
No, it's a great question. So we have actually only performed follow-up testing one time on these items because we've only been contracted to perform follow-up testing on them one time. Our preference generally from a standards perspective is to perform follow-up testing on an annual basis. So that's certainly our preference, just to make sure that we're keeping the committee apprised of what we're seeing, like what we're seeing here. But I think part of what's contributing to some of these, certainly as it relates to human resources, a change in leadership. There's actually been multiple changes in leadership since the time that we've performed this audit. So as Paul alluded to earlier, often what we find in change in leadership is they revisit these management action plans. So that's in part contributed to it.
Okay. I guess I'll just summarize my concern in that we spend an awful lot of money doing audits, and we spend a lot of time doing audits and audit compliance. And to see something that has not been fixed in 3 years is somewhat of a concern, given the level of detail that we put into it as an audit committee and that you put into it, and the resources that are used either financially or people-wise.
Yeah, Jim, and I would certainly defer to management on the call to add any additional context to maybe what's contributing to that, because I certainly agree with your sentiment.
Thank you.
And any other questions from any other committee members? Okay, I'm going to agree 100% with what Mr. Ward just said. I understand that we do have turnover in key positions, but if our prior superintendent made it very clear that the staff takes these audit findings extremely seriously, as did he in his position, and to see audit findings going back close to 3 years ago, and we have 4 out of the 5 area issues open on human resources. Granted, we only have 25% open on the purchasing. We have 100% non-compliance on contract. We have 20% open on the half-cent sales tax, and we have 50% open on e-cards. That's quite a bit. And I don't want to hold staff that their entire job responsibility is to ensure compliance with the audits. They obviously have other responsibilities to perform, but there needs to be some ownership at the highest level of management. And if staff is not going to be able to deliver, maybe what we include within our agenda going forward is an update, not quite to the level that you would be performing as RSM, but a management update that, yes, we're 60% through in addressing this one finding, and where do they sit, or are we 0% through in addressing the finding, or have we created mitigating controls until we can automate the process or create a better process as was recommended by RSM. I think we need to put this in a little bit better context. I agree with you. An annual review is what we need, but we do need some clarity from staff on a more regimented basis. I greatly appreciate the hard work that RSM has done on these audits and the audits that were presented previously. The one audit that I am still awaiting a management response is relating to the Riverdale audit. And I don't know if we have a formal management response on the Riverdale audit. We were presented with a report with no management responses.
Dr. Savage, did you have something to add there?
Yes, Dr. Savage.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah, I'm not a member, so I wanted to make sure I was acknowledged. About two things. One, just on the Riverdale piece, that's pretty easy to say. Our COO did develop a management response. We'll make sure that's forwarded to the audit committee as well for review. That was sent to the board members. And not only that, we're actually presenting a live workshop with the board soon. I think it's our very next workshop actually at the end of this month. So we'll be actually going over the management response and having the opportunity for questions on a recorded fashion for that transparency as well. Just in general, around all the other pieces that have been contemplated, just to summarize again, keeping it high level, what I would say is, there's three thematic aspects that are probably not just unique to these areas, but I think you can apply to a lot of different areas in the organization. One is standard operating procedures. What is the clear evidence that the procedures are known, that they are organized, that they're in writing, that they are of course trained, how retaught, analyzed, what's the completeness, the efficiency of those protocols, and so forth. Then there's a second theme that I would get to about the optimization of that particular piece. Are these procedures truly meeting the business need, or are they outdated? How have they been revised, revisited? Are there any type of data metrics that kind of inform to the efficacy of them as well? Or training, are they known and so forth? So just improving the efficiency of said procedures if they exist in writing at all. And then the third aspect that I heard really just in general again is the opportunity to automate or digitize where it makes sense, whether for efficiency's sake, whether it's to utilize the tools and so forth that you have. So what I would say is, in response to these are areas that were identified as part of our risk analysis. We don't run from that. We own that. That's why these areas are identified as areas we want RSM to look at. It's areas that we want to put in front of the audit. We fully embrace, I would say, from my management standpoint, cyclical audits, annual audits, follow-up testing. Absolutely, that is the way that you create a culture that truly embraces having standard operating procedures, refining and improving and optimizing those procedures wherever possible, and then also, of course, leveraging tools, putting resources into automation, because as has been mentioned, that is a hard endeavor. Just to give you a sense of that, as you mentioned in the very first one, the 2021 human resources, it's no coincidence that we are utilizing PeopleSoft for a lot of our different processes. And yeah, as we know, and is probably well recognized for this group, the way that we implemented our PeopleSoft implementation many years ago when we first went to the enterprise system was essentially to try to replicate old manual processes and then change the PeopleSoft enterprise system to conform to what we did, and this is upwards of 20 years ago, as opposed to adopting our enterprise system based on the way the system was designed to be utilized. Thusly, as the system itself gets updated, instead of us revising our procedures to essentially change what we were doing from a human standpoint, process standpoint, to conform to the automation, we kind of went the other way, and we tried to make it conform to what we were used to doing 20 years ago. The problem is we're still paying the price for that. So many of the systems that we have, we could not update, and required basically extensive modification of the system every time there is an update. And thusly, you'll see it. It's not just in these areas that you have, it's anywhere where we're utilizing the PeopleSoft system. Anywhere in our system, you find challenges such as these, where now we have these overly burdensome manual processes, and then a lot of times lacking process documentation or outdated process documentation, if process documentation exists at all, to try to utilize these pieces. So it is no surprise to me to find any of the findings that we had. That's why I'm sure our partners from RSM will attest to this. My candor in all of this is, when I went to operations for the first time, I started keeping a list of all the process deficiencies. By about a month on the job, that list numbered over 100. Each process in of itself would take a significant amount of labor hours to improve upon. So I would argue, wherever you cast a gaze, you are going to find massive deficiencies within the organization. And so for us, it's going to be more of prioritizing from a risk environment, where are the risks greatest, and prioritizing those aspects, because they are many. To fix it, in many cases, is costly. You're also asking people and leaders who have yet to remedy, in some cases, these process deficiencies and recreate processes, articulate better processes, that in many cases they're doing what they know best, or what they think they understand to do. And so that can be a very laborious process of their level best of what they did is what we're seeing today. It's what the evidence demonstrates is insufficient. And so one of the other asks I had for RSM was, as part of identifying these findings, anytime they're able to turn us to best-in-class exemplars of great standard operating procedures or complementary applications that support best-in-class standard operating procedures, so that I don't turn to the same leadership and administration that says, I thought we had a good process. Well, let me think what's a better way to do it, and then I'm going to then communicate what I think a better way is, even though I'm the one who developed the last process, or I've had 2 years on the job. For example, as we mentioned, we had a superintendent for the last 2 years. I'm here for the next 4 months. I think it's really important that as a culture, as an organization, we recommit to the idea that standard operating procedures matter, that it's essential, that it's important, and that it requires a lot of investment of time, energy, resources, and so forth. But also recognizing, as others have already said on the call, every time we are trying to balance the transactional day-to-day work with revising and updating your processes, when the people leading those charges may not necessarily have shown evidence of the capacity to lead such work and to do such work, to revise processes, hence, or they would have already begun that work. And so that's part of it, is, from my standpoint, is calling it out in an audit, having it documented so it exists, not because of a fear of an elected coming in, but the reality is, from all my prior experiences in leadership, audits become a perfect way to drive resources and leadership and professional development and training where you need them. And it highlights it, because the only thing that makes a leader worse off is when they see that these things are going unfixed repeatedly, and that the audits reveal a lack of attention to and resourcing and leadership in that piece. So I fully embrace all of this. I applaud RSM. I applaud the audit committee for asking the difficult questions. This is precisely the type of elevated understanding I want. I will say, as a caveat, RSM was clear to me that these are also somewhat common, as they find this in other school districts. And I get that. I understand that. But unfortunately, that's just not going to be good enough. The reality is, as long as we have leaders in place here, we're going to have to continue to try to, if we really want to be world class, then it's important that we are the exception in the positive, as opposed to being, consistently with other districts having struggles in these areas, and we have to resource and lead accordingly. So I just wanted to be able to comment on all, because you will find those common threads, even though it was a fleet management, the timekeeping, the asset management. It really started with those things. standard operating procedures, optimizing procedures, and automation where it made sense to do so. And so those thematic pieces you saw across all of them, and I would argue there's going to be many, many more. Every other aspect that you do that we bring forward through that risk area, you're going to see similar things. Standard operating procedures or the lack thereof, a real intentionality or an optimizing procedures. How do you know it? That's where I would bring data into it as well. Do you even have performance measurements that can inform on the health of your processes? And then number three, is there really an effort to make these procedures to digitize or to automate where it makes sense to do so, where it's efficient to do it, or to leverage existing resources, or to replace the resources if they cannot do it. So that's just a quick response to all of what we've covered so far today, but I'm happy to provide any additional clarity that is desired.
Any members of the committee?
Dr. Savage, you know, I think you just provided a perfect answer to what we're trying to accomplish here. The question is, how do we get from A to Z in terms of what you're trying to accomplish and how long it's going to take? But I applaud you for your view on this. And I have seen it happen in the past in my prior worlds where people try to adapt software to what they're used to doing. And it creates an unusual amount of problem as you go out into the future, and there's additional software updates that you can't implement because you've somewhat bastardized the system to accommodate what you used to do. So I applaud your recognition of the issues, and I hope that we can get to where we need to go with this.
Anyone else? Okay, I have a couple of comments I'd like to make. Dr. Savage, you mentioned something about determination of risk. Was that at a staff level, or is that RSM's identification of the risk?
Yes. Yeah. What I was referring to specifically was the RSM evaluation, but I would say we also added one of the things I wanted to do before was add a risk management component to our organization. It was something I felt was lacking last time I was in the interim role, was similar issues. We obviously tried to attract RSM to come back to the district. That was very important to me to have a partner in that work, and they've really exceeded expectations in many ways to me. But I would also say that's why I wanted a risk management component brought back to the organization. We did not have any risk management. And so that's just, again, to add more staff level awareness. We now do have risk management added back in the organization, which I'm thrilled to have, though that's not a part of this. But I was referring specifically to answer your question, Mr. Cohen, when we did the annual needs assessment to try to determine through RSM as part of our audit plan, what are those risk areas? And I'm sure they could articulate this back about my candor around the same types of things that I expressed, that it has to be there, and follow-up testing has to be a critical part of it, or you won't be able to close these out. You can't just trust it will happen. It's essential that we keep at least annually. I think that's very fair, especially for any areas of high risk, at the very least, that it has to be a part of our cyclical way of work, and that it creates accountability for it. So it was through the RSM process, so facilitated by them.
The other things I want to bring to mind, the board needs to understand that we have, as an audit committee, we have not seen management's response. Therefore, when they are being provided with management's response, it has to be with the caveat, and I'm hoping Mr. Persons brings this forward, that the audit committee has not had the opportunity to review or evaluate management's response to the findings. RSM will have had that opportunity. Management will have had that opportunity. Obviously, the board will, but the audit committee will have not yet. So I just want to make sure that's clear. Secondarily, a point was brought out about the rationale for not being able to complete some of the audit findings because of turnover. That actually underlines and underscores the need for written procedures. Granted, each new person that comes into a leadership role will most likely amend written procedure, but if we're working off, or departments are working off verbal procedures, that leaves too much opportunity, excuse me, for misinterpretation, different approaches to handling those responsibilities. And the other point I want to make sure we bring forward, and it's going to be my feeling, internal audit does not always have to be reactive. It can sometimes be a proactive approach. And if we are going to be looking at automation, I think it would be incumbent on the leadership of the district to speak with RSM and understand controls that need to be in place prior to implementation of automated processes. Because as Mr. Ward brought out, you can bring forward a lot of automated processes. It sounds in theory like it's going to eliminate a lot of your risks, and RSM can come in and bring out all of the loopholes that can now be created by going to an automated process. Sometimes there's an over reliance on that automated process for mitigating all the risk, and RSM can show you where it may increase risk in certain areas. People may not understand the entirety of the process because they're saying the system will do it for me, and therefore I really don't have to understand A to Z because the system's doing it. As long as I understand the general approach that the system's taking, I'll be okay. That's where RSM's expertise would come in. With that, I will leave it to presentation of our risk assessment. We are at 6:35. We currently do have a 7 p.m. hard stop. I want to recognize if we get close to 7, I will be entertaining a motion to extend the meeting as appropriate.
Perfect. You ready for me to get started, Paul?
Yes, please.
Okay, perfect. Just wanted to make sure. So I know this document is quite comprehensive, and I know we're closer on time. So what I'm going to do is just kind of briefly walk us through some of the proposed areas that we have here, and try to leave some room for discussion, so we can talk through kind of the audit areas that are of the utmost concern, and where priority may lie as we look ahead to the next fiscal year. So. Jack, if you can move to page 2 real quick. I just want to give you an idea of what this page is trying to communicate. It's really just talking through, one, what was our objective of this process, and that's really the result. That's our top 10 high-risk areas of focus that we'll talk through momentarily. We talked through some of the risk classifications that we're considering when we're evaluating risk on the right side there. But notably here on the approach section, that's where we talked through what we did. So we conducted a number of interviews, nearly 25 interviews with the audit committee, the board, and then members of management that were available. We reviewed the strategic plan for the district, as well as financial statement, current events, our prior risk universe, the areas that we've looked at in the past, and then any other information that was applicable to this process. We evaluated the risk within each process area based on the frequency that it was brought up through our discussions, as well as the severity of impact based on the operational objectives of those process areas. And all of this results in the proposed top 10, which we have outlined on page 7. So Jack, if you can move to page 7. Thank you. I will walk you through this, and I just want to highlight these are in no particular order. We have them included or highlighted here in alphabetical order, and that's because all of these are perceived as high inherent risk, right? So I just want to caveat that none of these were selected because we're included in this proposed plan because there's an issue that was identified, right? It just means that there's a high risk nature of the function that exists, and there's a higher potential for issues to develop. So because of that, we've included, and the way that we've structured the write-up is essentially for each of these areas to provide an overview of the function, what the inherent risks are, specific to that function, and what our audit strategy is applicable to each of these audit areas. So what I'll do is I'll briefly walk through what that strategy is for each of these areas. And then, like I said, I'll leave time for us to have some discussion on what priority looks like. So to start budgeting, so this is an area that we haven't had an opportunity to look at yet. Pretty considerable budget within Lee, $2.7 billion is just approximately that we're looking at from a consolidated budget. 4.4% increase in state funding, so it's certainly material. So our strategy is really to look at budget development. So we're looking at monitoring, reporting, and any modifications to the budget and what that process looks like. we're looking at segregation. We would be looking at segregation of duties, timeliness and accuracy of budget status reports. So what that communication channel looks like, and ultimately how data is obtained and reviewed for accuracy to make sure that the decisions that are being made off of comprehensive and accurate information. So that's budgeting. That would be our overarching review strategy. Capital planning is an area that we have included on the audit plan in the past. So it's probably no surprise to the committee. There's just over $1 billion budget representing 37.8% of the total budget for capital projects. So it's certainly high risk. The current 5-year plan focuses on a few new schools, the construction of 11 new schools. So more than a few, rebuilding 3 existing schools and campus renovations to 3 schools based on the information that was available when we were preparing this. So certainly a lot of efforts moving forward. This evaluation would look at how the district identifies and prioritizes capital improvement projects, how the monitoring and reporting of project progress is performed, as well as the performance and the outcomes of these projects, how those are evaluated. We would be looking at stakeholder engagement in this process, as well as compliance with state and federal regulations. The third area here is the charter school monitoring and compliance. So this is, certainly a hot topic in many districts. There's 21 charter schools that are operational within the district at the moment, comprising of just over 17% of the district schools. They have a budget of, $126 million, which has increased just over 7% year over year. And it's worth noting that charter schools have their own governing board, but the district does oversee the monitoring and planning of these charter schools. So they do have an investment. So our strategy would just be to look at or perform an evaluation of the high risk areas within the district's purview as it relates to charter schools, the monitoring processes that are in place, as well as those procedures and, compliance where we can evaluate with Florida statute, as well as the charter school contracts themselves. The fourth item that we have listed here is contract compliance. So you might remember in fiscal year 23, we did perform an internal audit of contracts. We identified many high-risk areas there, but one of which was that contract administration and monitoring, 2 of the highest risk components of contract management, are decentralized within those individual departments. That was one of our observations. So we have included in here a contract compliance audit, which really would be our recommendation to perform an analysis of high-risk contracts that exist and to perform a sampling of those contracts to evaluate contract administration, the vendor monitoring of those contracts, and ultimately compliance with contract provisions. So these are on detailed, specific contracts that we would be selecting and evaluating for compliance against. The fifth item here that we're showing is related to cybersecurity, and this is incident response, and this is based on some of the interviews that we've had with management. It's important to note cyber threats continue to evolve. So as such, the requirements for safeguarding that information, whether that's employee information, student information, or user information, becomes more and more critical. So this strategy would include an evaluation of the effectiveness and the maturity of the incident response program. So that includes things like the notification and escalation procedures, the impact and prioritization methods that are in place, backup restoration, as well as detection and response mechanisms. So a cybersecurity focus, we always like to include IT audit areas where we can, as there's a high risk there. And given influence from management, we certainly believe this would be a great consideration. The next item here is employee timekeeping cycle audit. So I gave this away a little bit earlier. Given the results that we found through employee timekeeping, we think that it would be prudent for us to include a cycle audit of employee timekeeping, really just to continue to apply some sort of monitoring over these decentralized individual departments that we've identified, who again have various methods for reporting and capturing time in the system. So we just want to make sure that we have some ongoing oversight there. The strategy would be to evaluate on a sample basis, as we've done in the past, controls over time tracking, recording, monitoring, and reporting. And I'll just note in our write-up here, our audit this year was focused on hourly employees, those non-exempt employees. This audit would expand to include salaried employees as well, as there are additional risk considerations that need to be considered there. Moving forward, we have ESE services as an area here. These are the individual education plans. Specifically, we'd be looking at these plans that outline things like goals, services, and support that should exist for students. We would be looking to evaluate compliance with development and implementation of these IE plans, and on a sample basis, verify compliance with these plans. Facilities maintenance is number 8 here that we have included. Probably not. This is one that we've talked about in our prior risk assessments. Considerable budget, about 21% of the operations budget is dedicated to this to maintenance, just over $20 million, and it's a significant increase over year, 21%. So we certainly think this is something that's top of mind for the district. We have just over 26 million earmarked for school construction, safety measures, maintenance, and technology from the sales tax surcharge funding. So there's certainly a lot of money and efforts being put towards maintaining these facilities. Our strategy would be to evaluate the work order prioritization of these projects, maintenance specific, adherence to preventative maintenance work order schedules, and detailed testing of a sample of work orders to make sure that those approvals exist, the expenditures are supported, and that the priority methods have been followed and maintained to ensure that the district can meet its obligations and objectives. The second to last item that we have here is grant management. This is certainly another material component for the district. Special revenue fund totals 141 million for this past fiscal year, just about 5% of the budget. So this is a pretty considerable amount of money. This strategy would include an evaluation of the major components of the grant lifecycle. So that's from application to final reporting, as well as reviewing financial records, progress reports, and performance metrics related to grant management. This is a common audit area that we look at for districts, certainly when you consider the increase in funding. The goal here would be to make sure the controls exist to not just manage those fundings, but to report and make sure that the information that is reported is complete and accurate. Lastly, we have HR offboarding. So if you remember in 2021, we did review HR onboarding and recruiting. So this recommendation here is the back end of that process. So certainly, as you can imagine, as the county's second largest employer, the district has a number of employees. There's also been significant turnover as we've discussed here. So it is critical to have effective offboarding procedures. So our strategy would be to evaluate the efficiency, the effectiveness, as well as compliance with current offboarding procedures, employee termination protocols, document retention procedures, communication, and of course, the handling of sensitive data through this process. That is the 10th item here, and I know I went through those very fast, but I wanted to make sure we had time remaining to talk through and get your feedback. So with that, I'll pause and open it up to the committee.
Any members of the committee?
Jim Ward again. You talked about doing a cycle audit on employee timekeeping, and there are some areas where you have done audits before. So how does it differentiate between a cycle audit and something that you've already audited in the past, but you're going to redo it again?
It's a great question. So it really comes down to scope, right? So the scope of our cycle audit would be more specific and tailored to detailed testing for compliance versus reevaluating all the components of the process, unless there's been changes to the process, of course.
So in other words, cycle audits, when we first approach an area like we did with this round of the first audit that we just presented on timekeeping today, we try to get a good understanding and do some testing across the entire organization. So we looked at the different types of timekeeping, methodologies, the 4 different types that we identified and laid out in the background of the report. In a cycle audit, and that's more of like a mile wide and an inch deep, even though I think it's arguably deeper than an inch, but that's kind of the description of what we presented today. A cycle audit would allow us to kind of go, very narrow focus and go very deep in one particular area or in one department or in one different specific type of timekeeping. And then we would kind of hit that every year. So we do one this year, one next year, one the following year. And then, if the process stays the same and there's 4 areas, basically every 4 years, an entire audit would be done in one, very specific area. if that makes sense. It's about, like White said, it's scope, but it's very narrowly focused and allows us to dig deep to really identify if there are any major issues in a particular area.
And the time frame in which you do these audits would be what?
So that can vary. If it was on the audit plan for next year, we'd probably look back at the last year or two. Kind of depends on if there have been any major changes in the process, or if there's been turnover, if there's any kind of, date that, so we say, okay, maybe for whatever, there could be many reasons why it doesn't make sense to look at anything prior to X date. So, we would, whenever we would, if this was selected for next year, we would hopefully start, in the fall time of 2024 and be working through fall and spring of 2025, but looking back usually a year, maybe two, depending.
So the 10 audits would be done within a 1 to 2 year period.
Oh, so I would have to defer to I guess either Kathy or Dr. Savage on the specific budget that the board has for the internal audit program. In this past year, we've certainly never done 10 audits in a single year. We typically use this meeting to select 3 or 4 that we will focus on for the audit plan for the next year.
That's kind of where I was leading to, because I didn't think you would do 10 in a year or even 2. But but the 10 that you've identified came out of discussions, interviews with the people that you highlighted on page 6.
Correct.
Okay. Hate to sound self-serving here, but I did have an interview with you guys, and I don't see my name on page 6. So I don't know why that would have happened.
That looks like that might just be an oversight, Jim. We can make sure that we get that corrected on the or redacted.
All right, thank you.
Okay. To answer your question, Mr. Ward, what we've normally done in the past is we've identified approximately 4 to 5 audits, including a risk assessment and a follow-up audit. Those recommendations go to the board. We do not allocate an amount of time to be spent on those audits, nor do we identify a budget for those audits. That is left to the board to determine. Our responsibility is to perform is to assess the 10 recommended audits that RSM is bringing forward and prioritize them in order that we feel appropriate. If we feel that the current order is appropriate, we can move forward with a recommendation to the board that over the course of, and if we want to, over the course of a 2 or 3 year period, that our recommendation would be the performance of the below 10 audits plus an annual follow-up audit and plus an annual risk assessment document. But with this in place, we could probably postpone the performance of a risk assessment, since this will carry over to subsequent school years.
I guess as a follow-up, wouldn't we be better served to get the answers or the items, for example, the 4 items that were identified that were still open in human resources? Wouldn't it be to our benefit to get those resolved before getting into something additional?
If you can elaborate a little bit further on that, Mr. Ward, because what we can't do is we don't want to postpone the performance of an audit because we are now awaiting management's action on a prior audit.
Well, I was specifically referencing the human resources offboarding, which we discussed earlier, that was done in 2021 and still had 4 areas that needed to be addressed.
And that audit, we could always request that RSM perform the follow-up. And with that audit being number 10 on the list, we're probably not going to be revisiting that area for potentially 2 to 3 years from now. With RSM doing approximately 4 audits per year at best, plus their follow-up and any other specialty audits that they may be requested to perform on behalf of the board.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Okay, there are a couple of questions I did have. With this being the first time that we're going to have an elected superintendent, and sadly, the way politics operate, at least have been operating on a national level, with the context of political payback, I think that we probably would need to revisit to some extent within vendor management contributions to political campaigns of the elected superintendent, just to make sure that the public understands that there was no political payback. And if there was, that would be a completely different conversation with the school board. But I think for the public's benefit, especially since it's the first time we're doing this, we need to put their mind at ease that an elected superintendent is going to put the district in the best possible light in every sense of the word. Secondly, with some of the audit findings that were previously noted and the corrective action centered around automation, as part of the audit plan going forward, we may want to have RSM visit automation as relates to prior audit findings and also other areas that we have not yet visited where they are planning on utilizing automation for creation of a control environment. So those are just two things. If RSM, if you want to build it into any of the audits within your current audit plan, obviously we will discuss with you as an audit committee some of the scope. But at the same time, we want to make sure, I want to make sure at least those two areas are addressed within the scopes of your audit. Ms. Bruno and then Mr. Persons.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Cohen. With regards to the contributions to either an elected superintendent or board members as they're running for office, that is controlled by Chapter 112, the Florida Code of Ethics, and it does have parameters that allow those contributions. So I just wanted to make sure that the audit committee was aware. I'm sure RSM is aware. I don't know how that would impact the scope of what you wanted them to look into.
Okay, to answer that, Ms. Bruno, what I'm looking for is if somebody makes a sizable contribution to a campaign, we need to ensure that the public, should a contract be awarded to that company, that they were evaluated in the same way as any other bidder for the work. And that would be something that RSM, at the end of the day, it's a decision that's being made based on dollar amount at the school board level or at the superintendent level. But there should be some, especially since we've already encountered some concerns with the vendor management process, we need to get our arms better around it, especially since this is our first time through with an elected superintendent. I fully agree with you and understand your thoughts as relates to the Code of Ethics. And this will, just as we did with the sales tax, we wanted to ensure that the public knew that their sales tax dollars were being spent as appropriate. We should also give the voters the confidence to know that everything is being handled on an ethical line as relates to, more importantly, the superintendent. With the school board, you have other school board members who could veto that decision. With the school superintendent, it's one individual who has the authority to do things above and beyond without an oversight position based on dollar amount. And I would hope that Code of Ethics does not step into this.
Yes, so I think just for my clarification then, I think what you're asking for is a review of the procurement process as well as our policies that dictate how vendors are retained and hired for different projects, and when they are approved by the board and when they are approved by the superintendent, or perhaps you're looking for those that are approved by the superintendent and a closer dive into that through the procurement process. I just want to, just for my mind, just to make sure that I'm clear and I understand the ask.
I would take it as two phases. First phase would be at the superintendent level. Second phase would be at the school board level. But as I said, the school board level, you do have other individuals on the school board who can override a vendor decision. At the superintendent level, there is no level above them except based on dollar amount. So I would be looking more at the superintendent level, the first brush through with procurement. I fully agree with you. Compliance with the existing policies and procedures.
Okay.
And if there is an exception, we need to understand how that exception was granted and documented.
So that would be.
Hopefully that's clear.
Okay, so I understand a little bit more. So that would be everything under $50,000, some of it which would go through the regular procurement process, some of which would not go through that process, but the superintendent per policy is authorized to approve anything under 50,000.
That would be correct. And I'm going to apologize. I am going to need a motion to continue the meeting. We are at 6:59. And
So
then Mr.
moved.
Persons. Okay, Mr. Ward, thank you. Can I have a second, please? Mr. Carrington, would you be able to second that motion?
Second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. Mr. Persons.
Yeah, I think you're opening up a huge can of worms. I mean, first off, the most that anyone can give to a school board member or to a superintendent or to any other elected official, locally like this is $1,000. And there's many, many, many. I mean, it sounds like either we would not want them to make a donation to anybody, which impedes on their freedom of it's called freedom of speech, or if they do, then they can't bid on anything because they donated to somebody's campaign. I mean, I think because all the contributions are listed online on the lector site. So anyone that thinks there's a misuse of that can surely use our whistleblower or anything along those lines, and we could look into it for something along those lines. But for us just to go delving in, my problem is, let's say someone gave $1,000 to the superintendent and the superintendent awarded them a contract that they've done in the past and the future or whatever. And there were other people that gave $1,000 that didn't get the contract. I mean, it just gets real confusing. I don't see what finding RSM could actually come up with other than, yeah, there were 10 contracts where people gave money and there were 100 contracts where nobody gave money or something, but that doesn't tell us anything. I just think it's a bad idea. That's all.
Paul, I think you're muted.
I'm sorry. I'm looking for a motion from the committee to make a motion to the school board to approve an audit plan for whether it be for the coming school calendar year or for subsequent calendar years. Since we have 10 audits that are being recommended by RSM, we do not have to approve all 10, but we should be making some recommendation to the school board as relates to audits that we believe would be appropriate to be performed on a priority level.
Paul, I'm sorry, are you looking for a list of the 4 or 5 we want to do this year and prioritize? Or are you looking for an approval for the 10 and we'll schedule them at a later point in time?
That would be up to the committee, Mr. Ward. We can do it either way. We could recommend 4 or 5 audits. The school board will determine based on budget how many audits they wish to have performed. We're making the recommendation that we believe that these are the highest risk areas that the school board should be considering within a contractual relationship with RSM to perform. And the school board will make the determination on dollars and hours for the audits to be performed. So we can make a recommendation for 3 or 4, possibly up to 5 audits. It may not all be performed within the current school calendar year. We also need to include in that the follow-up audit. Unfortunately, as chair, I can't make a motion, or I should not be, Ms. Bruno.
Yeah, Mr. Cum, if my memory serves me correctly, I believe in the past, from this list of 10, the audit committee would pick 4 or 5 that they felt was top priority, and the entire list of 10 would go to the school board with the recommendation of the 4 or 5 that they felt was a top priority, and then the board can consider the 4 or 5 that's recommended by the audit, but also if they found that there was something in that list of 10 that they also wanted to have reviewed or maybe exchanged for one of the 4 or 5 that gave them the latitude. So if my memory serves me correct, I think that's what was done in the past.
You're absolutely correct, Ms. Bruno. That is exactly how it was presented and exactly how the school board entertained the motion. And remember, every report that has been presented to us this evening is being presented to the school board. So the school board will have access to the risk assessment document plus the rationale for each of those auditable areas. Dr. Savage, did you have your hand up, or is that up from prior?
Oh, thank you, Mr. Cohen. Yeah, I would just say all 10 of these are very worthy, but that was my question, because I just want to make sure we weren't confusing. The human resources offboarding was not a continuation of that. That's essentially it's a separate aspect of that process. The recruiting and onboarding would want follow-up potentially. The offboarding is really a critical body of work for us as well, just because you're also talking about the retention aspect of employees we're losing. So not just how we're getting them and are they prepared, but then why are they leaving? What do those processes look like to give us those insights and so forth? So I just want to make sure that was earlier. The comments made it sound like that was potentially a follow-up, and really it is an extension of a different component within the HR apparatus, but all the other ones as well, they represent various different risk areas. But it also kind of, my recollection is what Kathy Dupuy Bruno said, which was, 4 to 5 of them came forward. All of them were brought forward to the board, but that 4 to 5 potential recommendations. But I just wanted to kind of validate from the management side. To me, all of these are pertinent. Obviously they could be ordered right now. They're listed alphabetically. So I would say, in terms of critical significance to the organization and balancing the timeliness and the different types of risks that they may be engaged with, I think that would be helpful too, potentially, to look at it and say which of these maybe, provides a significant priority for us at this time, and then some maybe on the back half of that 2-year plan. I think that would be good feedback potentially to consider as you think about developing an audit plan.
Thank you, Dr. Savage. If I can, from RSM, and Dr. Savage brought out a very good point, since this is alphabetical. In your professional judgment, which would you deem to be the 5 highest risked auditable areas?
I would say there's 4 that come to mind based on the frequency of being brought up through our interview process, as well as the materiality. I think capital planning would be critical, considering some of the things that we've seen through previous audits, as well as the investment moving forward, understanding that process. The cybersecurity, the incident response, I think is critical. It was something explicitly brought up by management as an opportunity. It's an area we haven't looked at from an IT lens, and of course that's an important lens to look through. Facilities maintenance, I think, is critical. Again, just the investment there. I think it's critical. We haven't had an opportunity to look at that, and that's one of the core audit areas. When we think about A, B, and C's, right, from an internal audit perspective, that's another one. And in budgeting, I think as we consider the transition to an elected superintendent, I think not only is this an opportunity to get our hands around the budgeting process that we haven't looked at yet, but it also could be an educational opportunity. It's an area that the board will have explicit control over. So understanding where there might be opportunities there, I think would be important. So those are 4 that come to mind. The 5th one, I think I would leave it. I would certainly, I think they're all worthy.
Okay, thank you.
Paul, it's Jim Ward.
Yes,
RSM just hit on pretty much 4 of the 5 that I had in terms of capital planning, cybersecurity, facility management, budget, grant management, and I had HR as a 5th, and grant management as something. I don't know the scope of that. I don't know what the dollar amount. I think somebody referenced it earlier, what the scope of the dollar amount was on grant management. But I don't think that's been done before, has it?
no,
It
it
has-
is
yeah.
not.
Sorry, Paul, go ahead.
I believe you had said 104 million, if I remember correctly, Weiss.
141 million, and we haven't had an
141.
opportunity to look at the broader process. We have looked at some of the individual processes within grants purview, but not the broader grants management process.
Okay, Mr. Ward, I would tend to agree with the ones that you brought forward. I have the same 4 in my mind that RSM brought forward. And I'm comfortable either with grant management or even contract compliance, going to either of those 2 audits. We've been doing human resources. We can obviously revisit human resources again, but we're going to have human resources as part of our follow-up, covering some of that with payroll and some of the other audits. So if you're comfortable with making a motion for the 4 or 5, the 4 that RSM recommended, and if you have a 5th that you think is appropriate, I think we move forward through that recommendation.
Either grant management or HR. Let's go with grant management.
Okay, so if I'm hearing correctly, Mr. Ward, and I don't want to put words into your mouth, you're recommending the performance of a budgeting, capital planning, cybersecurity, facilities management, and grant management audits.
That's correct.
Okay, I would entertain a second of that motion. I'm looking for any other member of the audit committee to please second that motion.
I'll second it.
Thank you, Mr. Carrington. With that, is there any further discussion relating to those 5 audits to recommend to the school board?
If I may,
Yes, Mr. Persons.
I think one area that I get a lot of feedback on is the exceptional student education. We spend a lot of money there, and the parents and I personally don't know if we're doing a really good job of that. So it's a very difficult area. And I don't know if RSM has looked into that at other schools. Is it much of a problem at other districts? I mean, have y'all done that audit with other school districts, and how does that work out?
Yeah, so we've addressed it in different ways. So we've looked at as part of our audits areas where ESE students and some of the services they're expected to be provided are incorporated into those audits. So in small pieces we have. I do want to highlight when we think about risk related to this area, we did look at the Florida Education Finance Program, the FTE student enrollment and student transportation report that's issued by the Florida Auditor General as recent as 2022. And there were minimal findings related to ESE services within that report. That being said, It's certainly been a number of years since that report was presented. So I think that shows there's certainly progress. There were findings, but they were minimal. And so I just want to highlight that was a report issued by the Florida Auditor General in 2022.
All right, that was my only question on that one. I just didn't know what all would be involved in that. Thank you.
Okay. Any further discussion? With that, I will look for a vote. All in favor?
I have
Yes,
a quick
Ms.
question. Weiss, that audit report that you were just talking about, was it specifically with regards to the services rendered to the students, or was it just about the transportation and making sure that they were receiving the busing services and things like that?
It was the FTE audit, so it wasn't about the services. It didn't evaluate necessarily to the extent of our scope. That's why I wanted to add that
Okay.
context.
So it was just whether or not they were receiving the additional funds because of the services that were required for them, but not specifically whether or not they were getting the proper assessments or the services themselves.
Correct. The report just
Okay.
highlights that the FTE agreed to the was correct, because if it was, that influenced funding. So they did a reconciliation of that.
So was this recommendation an audit for the services or for the funding?
So this audit would be specifically around the scope of the individual education plans and the services outlined in those. So we would do sampling to verify that those services were in fact being performed. We wouldn't be evaluating the sufficiency or the appropriateness of the services. There's obviously experts in the field that are determining those. We would be simply evaluating for compliance.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Bruno. With that, all in favor of the motion for Mr. Ward, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Is Mr. Carrington still on? I know he's having some difficulties.
Yeah, he said his thing was, I'm waiting to see if he pops back in here. It's showing him as being on, but he may be trying to transfer over.
Okay, Dawn, if we have the ability, could you put it through chat to Mr. Carrington and Mr. Severson? I'm not hearing a yay from either of the two gentlemen. So we have ensure that we still do have quorum on the vote. While Dawn's collecting that, I will also entertain an additional motion for the performance of a follow-up audit and recommending to the board that a follow-up audit be performed within the next school year. Since we have already determined that we would like to see that performed annually, we need to make that recommendation to the school board so they can budget accordingly or opt not to have that audit performed.
You're looking for a motion on that?
Yes, I am, please.
So moved.
Can I have a second, please? Mr. Severson? Or Mr. Carrington?
I'll second.
Thank you, Mr. Carrington. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, let the minutes reflect that the motion was passed. Dawn, I'm going to assist you because you brought out earlier that you had had a typo. If RSM could just fix the cover page of their presentation, it shows June 26, 2022. Which just shows that we're all human.
Human error, see, manual error right there. I will get that corrected, and as well as the interview page to have your name added there, Jim.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions for RSM? Hearing none, I want to go on record and thank RSM for all the hard work that they've done, the strong level of communication that they've exhibited as well. They keep me very well informed during our meetings. They keep all of the committee members, I'm hoping you all would agree, very well informed, the school board very well informed, and I greatly appreciate that.
We appreciate the opportunity to be of service to the district. Thank you, Mr. Cohen.
Thank you. With that, I'm going to backtrack slightly. We do not have any minutes for approval this evening. I'm going to open it up to board member comments and then superintendent comments. Mr. Persons?
Unmute.
You're on mute, Mr.
You
Persons.
muted. You muted.
I really don't have much of this time. I just barely made it to the meeting. I just got back from RV trip to Maine. So I was, it was a lot of fun. And with my wife and I didn't kill each other. So somehow we made it through it. But I appreciate RSM's total work there. It's really good. The more on these audits I learn, the more I really appreciate the need for it. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Savage?
Yeah, just again, want to echo your appreciation for RSM. I made my comments earlier in the meeting in response to that piece. That's really all I had to say, other than just sincere appreciation for their partnership, as well as the audit committee. Just appreciate your just helping to facilitate this piece and create this critical aspect of accountability for the system. It really is a district. It's not just for the board. All of this is to help us operationally as well. So they fulfill a critical function for us to improve. So thank you to all involved.
Thank you. The only comment I want to bring forward, during our May meeting and prior to that, the committee spent a considerable amount of time reviewing the job description for the auditor or the board's auditor for the district. I was a little bit dismayed when I did not see the committee's recommendations incorporated into the document that was presented to the school board. The school board did move forward with that document without hearing from the audit committee as relates to their recommendations to that job description. And with that, Dr. Savage.
Yep, I just wanted to I absolutely want to highlight something. So essentially what happened was when we migrated with superintendents and so forth, and we had some new HR staff coming on board, they were charged with taking the feedback of the group and putting it into the board auditor. And unfortunately, what they did was incorporated it into the old, which was the current board approved board auditor job description. And unfortunately, this just had multiple hands in it. So you had different people holding this piece. And what happened was we had an old, I say old, but it was the board adopted board auditor, which was not the one that had been presented to the audit committee. The audit committee had actually had a different job description, which reflected the totality of pieces pulled from other districts that was more current. And so they were making edits based on the old one. And so unfortunately, it was just a very difficult situation. So what I articulate to the board, which I stand by here, is just because the board approved and adopted a job description does not preclude us from being able to continue to revise. And so I would just say for the audit committee, we definitely would want to have your feedback. What we wanted to also make sure, though, is that it reflected the totality of the audit committee's feedback, not individual members only, so that whatever revisions the audit committee would want, we would ask you to maybe substantively make a motion to say, these are the specific edits we would want, whether that's a red line copy that gets provided to the board. What we don't want to have is individual members guiding the HR in that piece. And there's lots of opportunity for us to do that. Obviously, no one's been hired yet for anything of that along those lines. So it stands. We revise job descriptions all the time. So while this fulfills an operational function, we do want the audit committee to be able to provide that feedback. So my recommendation to this group would be, as you review the current board adopted version, which is the newer version, there's definitely an opportunity for continued feedback. And I'm sure the board would be amenable to considering anything like that. Certainly, we as administration would be more than happy to take that. But what we'd ask is that this group, rather than it being one-offs with HR people that we don't know if it reflects the will of the committee, the thought process would be that if the committee could take that job description that now is presently actually board adopted, which the last time y'all in May, it was a draft that you were providing feedback that they then in turn tried to incorporate into the prior description. So I'm sorry that that's hard to explain, but basically we still have an open door for that. We still would love to have any additional feedback to improve upon the current draft that's there, but we just want to make sure we're doing it in a way that is reflecting the will of the audit committee as its entirety. So that would be my initial comment back to that, Mr. Cohen, other than just, we definitely do not want to waste the audit committee's time. And we apologize that that was done in that way. We were really trying to get the audit, the board auditor piece so that we could start advertising that and allow for the board to start to try to consider that in due time prior to an elected superintendent assuming office. That was a kind of a critical priority for the board, but we do want to make sure that it reflects the audit committee's totality of feedback, and we're still open for that and for any future revisions, which could come at any board action meeting in the future. That would occur anytime that we could get those revisions and incorporate it. Just the speed to do that.
Thank you. Mr. Persons, if you can make sure that it's documented somewhere. We did not meet as an audit committee in the month of June. We were supposed to. The request was that Human Resources was revisiting the job description. We were trying to give staff the ability to revise the document before having an audit committee meeting. So I don't want the school board under the misimpression that we did not take that responsibility seriously because their job description was presented and that they did not receive a recommendation from this committee related to that. You were at that meeting. You saw that we spent close to an hour and a half reviewing and evaluating and making recommendations regarding that job description. Sadly, we're the only committee where the school board does not receive a report from the chair of that committee. So they do not get to hear from a committee chair what's transpired at the committee level. So I'm asking you to please do that.
I will definitely do that. No problem.
Thank you. With that said, Dawn, if you can please coordinate with Dr. Savage to get a copy of the most recent job description for the board auditor, distribute it to the members of the committee, and we will coordinate our next meeting. I would recommend probably early in the month of August so that we can review that and make any subsequent recommendations. Ms. Bruno?
Yeah, Mr. Cohen, the committee and the chair, when the audit committee was created, there was a thought that the audit committee would be able to come into a board meeting like all of the other board advisory committees and either make a report or explain their recommendation for either the audit plan or whatever it is that you want to do. So that option still remains. I just want to make sure that it's clear because you do have that option to come into the board and talk to them directly. And I just want to, if I may, Mr. Chairman, just a cleanup for Dawn. Dawn, because there was some communication in the chat, I want to make sure that is printed and attached to the minutes because, you know, I want to make sure that it's disclosable if anybody makes a public records request and wants to know what happened in the chat, okay? That's what I do with my other advisory committees.
Okay.
Thank you.
And thank you, Ms. Bruno. Unfortunately, that information was never brought forward at the committee level with a number of the other advisory committees. It's not only the chair, but the vice chair also would have the ability to speak, whether it be at the board level or with the superintendent. And sadly, I know what policy dictates, but it never found its way into procedure. So if we now have that ability, I would appreciate the ability to present, if nothing else, a report to the board of the activities of the audit committee. I had no idea that we had that capability because even with our self-assessment, that document was presented to the board through your office. So it was not presented as the other advisory committees would have done. It was presented through a different channel to the board. So I don't want to overstep our committee's responsibility in reporting to the board. And if it needs to go through a certain channel, I want to make sure we comply with that channel of communication. If everybody could look at your calendars, and I'm not asking for this evening because we do have several individuals who are not present tonight, and get back to Dawn mid-month of August so that we can evaluate the job description for the board auditor. And the context of that meeting would center around any recommendations. Please do not have any communication amongst yourselves, as that would violate sunshine. All communication can be through Dawn, but I would rather have a meeting in the sunshine. It could absolutely be done the way we're doing tonight's meeting to make further recommendations regarding the existing job description for the board's auditor. With that, I will leave it open for anybody having any comments for the good of the order. Hearing none, I will entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting at 7:28 p.m.
So moved.
Can I hear a second, please?
I think Dan is, but we can't hear him.
Okay, that's fine. If Mr. Severson has, the meeting is adjourned at 7:28 p.m. Thank you all for your time and contribution to the meeting.
Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Good night. Good night.
Good night.